And if we circle back to even just the mindfulness, are there specific techniques that you yourself or with clients that you find, if you're introducing a young athlete or a client who's new to that, are there certain techniques, whether it's a breathing technique, whether it's, mindful immersion or some of these different strategies that we can use to get people onboarded onto this?
Yeah, I've experimented a ton. And I think what I've found resonates most for people who want to get started is music. And the way I've used music is, I've asked someone to pick an instrumental track to a song that they can tolerate listening to for 5 minutes. So, I don't necessarily want you picking your favorite song. And I think there's value to picking a novel song where you're sort of like having to pay attention, but then pick out one instrument or one element of that track and see if you can just follow that track the whole time. And then you can start to see, when you get distracted, come back to that part of the track. When you get distracted, come back. And people
Nice.
have varying experiences around that. Some folks really quickly immerse into that following that track, and other folks, it's like, oh, I can't even get to the one, I don't know what to pick.
Yeah.
But I think it's a pretty accessible way to introduce the concept that doesn't necessarily rely on some of the more popular social techniques, right? Things like breathing,
Yeah.
or mindful eating, which, all of those have tremendous value. But I think it can feel daunting to people to say, hey, sit in a chair for 2 minutes and,
Yeah.
take 3 deep breaths,
Think
close your
about how
eyes.
you're breathing.
Yeah, that's it.
Think about how I'm breathing. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
like adding a
Exactly.
stressor, but I like that. I mean, that's a great idea around just listening to a track or music, and then you can immerse yourself in that. It's amazing to see just how much things have changed since I played basketball, because it's amazing to see at the end of practices now, coaches, the young players, even, lying on the floor after a stretch, maybe putting their hand on the belly, doing a little bit of this breathing, but again, in an environment that feels pretty safe, and it is a short time span. So that's pretty cool to see. And you mentioned reframing there, and Dr. Peter Jensen, our sports psych at Canada Basketballs, talked a lot about reframing, and that's something that's also hugely powerful. I mean, again, if we come back to this narrative, and I'm sure people, practitioners working with their clients or people who are successful in other domains, you're going to get to a point where you don't achieve it, or there's a roadblock in the way. And it sounds so simple to reframe, but it can be really challenging for athletes, especially again, when we're used to success and we get to a very high level. And this is the first time that we might be getting, rejection or failure. Can you walk people through that sort of reframing process? And again, maybe some of the techniques that you might use?
Sure. I mean, so I think the first thing that's really important to note that you've hit on too is to just remember that this is a skill, right? So like anything, you don't just show up to the championship game with no practice and hope that you score 40 points, right? Like you got to put in the work, and mental skills and mental training is no different. And so, when you get to those big moments, the more practice you have, subtly reframing events in your everyday life, I think it can really make a big difference. And so for me, reframing is all about sort of redirecting attention to a more helpful way of thinking about a particular problem. I tend to gravitate less towards specific language use or positive or negative, because I think what I've found in my experience is sometimes that's sort of like self-critical internal dialogue can actually be pretty motivating for people, and
Mhm.
there's some interesting work out there that suggests that, like, a little bit of quote unquote negative emotion is actually a sort of necessary component of striving for high performance, right? Like
And that's
failure
like the
is
old school basketball. What I grew up with was, the tongue lashing to get everything going, which does work, but it's sort of, there's a tipping point, I imagine.
yeah, I don't want that for everyone, right? And so I think my argument would be for a more nuanced approach, right?
Yeah,
And a
for
little
sure.
bit of individualization there. But I
Yeah.
do think there are some people that it does work to sort of, have the internal dialogue be, a little bit more kind of critical sounding, if you will. But I think a few things are relevant here. So the first is putting the experience into perspective, right? I think that's a really helpful one. So if I even go sort of out of the sport domain and think about my work with college students,
Mhm.
failing an exam in the moment feels like a huge experience.
Yeah.
I can honestly say 10 years later, not a single person I've ever met has ever asked me about
That
any
exam
exam.
I had.
Right. And
Yeah.
I think that's a great way of just sort of helping people put a different spin on it.